Hello guys, and welcome to day 7, the final day of Freak Week. So today's story is really creepy. It definitely freaked me out learning about it. It's just a very eerie story, and so I decided to save it for the last day. Today I will be telling you about the murder of Roland T. Owen in room 1046. But before we get into that, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor for today, and that is Audible. So obviously, we love Audible around here. I have been using Audible for so long before they were sponsoring me. As many of you know, I am not a big reader. I have a learning disability and it just makes reading really not enjoyable. So that's why I love listening to audiobooks. It makes the experience so much more enjoyable for me. Audible has the largest selection of audiobooks on the planet, and now with Audible Originals, the selection has gotten even more custom and even bigger, with content made especially for their members. Every month, Audible members get 1 credit good for any audiobook they choose, plus 2 Audible Originals from their ever-changing selection. And you can't get these anywhere else. And what's really nice is your audiobooks are yours to keep. You can go back and listen to any of the books that you have in your library, even if you are no longer an Audible member. Another great thing about Audible is that if you get your book and it ends up not really being your style, you're just kind of like not into it, you can exchange it for another book, no questions asked. And Audible is offering my audience their first audiobook for free, along with 2 free Audible Originals. Just go to audible.com/Kendall Rae or text Kendall Rae to 500-500. This time I wanted to mention one of the greatest true crime books, A Stranger Beside Me by Anne Rule, which is all about Ted Bundy, as she had a very one-on-one experience with him that no one else really had. It's a very intriguing story. I think you guys would really find it interesting. So be sure to check it out. Maybe download it as your first free Audible book. Again, just go to audible.com/Kendall Rae or text Kendall Rae to 500-500. All right, so let's talk about the unsolved murder of room 1046. So this story actually takes place in Kansas City, Missouri at the Hotel President. It takes place back in 1935 though, so things were quite different. It was Wednesday, January 2nd, and a man came to the hotel and he called himself Roland T. Owen, and he checked into the hotel. And he was said to be somewhere between age 20 and age 35, which is a pretty big gap, so people didn't really know how old he was. He was said to have brown hair, a large scar on his scalp, and then he also had something called cauliflower ear, which typically happens from injuries from like UFC fighting or being punched in the ear or the face, some type of blunt trauma to the ear, because it's such a sensitive area. It's so soft and it often can be damaged and then form scar tissue that does not go away. It's called cauliflower ear. So this guy was said to have had that. So when Roland first got to the hotel, a bellboy named Randolph Probst helped him take his bags up to his room. And like you may have guessed, he was staying in room 1046. Now, one thing that the bellboy noticed was pretty strange about Roland is he didn't have like anything with him, and everything that he did have, he was carrying on his person, like in his pockets and stuff. And in his pocket, he had a hairbrush, toothpaste, and a toothbrush. So pretty simple stuff. He didn't have any clothes with him or anything else. And as soon as he checked into the hotel, he immediately left. Eventually he came back to the hotel, and at some point a maid went up there, and her name was Mary. And when she was cleaning his room, apparently he asked her not to lock the hotel door from the inside. That's one thing I don't understand about this story. I think the hotel's doors were really weird, or something's being miscommunicated, because according to the story, basically you could be locked inside of these hotel rooms. He basically told her to leave the hotel door open so that his friend could just come in. In addition to this, Roland kept it completely dark in his room except for a small lamp in the corner. And Mary the maid said that she felt like he was paranoid about something, scared of someone, was worried about something. She generally could feel his anxiety, and she knew something wasn't right with him. So later that day, around 4 p.m., Mary came back to the hotel room to bring some fresh towels. The door was still unlocked, so she just went ahead and walked in, which is so weird. But anyway, she saw Roland just laying in the dark on his bed, not doing anything, just laying there, fully clothed, not like under the covers sleeping. He was just like chilling. So she went about her maid duties like normal, and she ended up seeing a little note in the corner of their room that said, "Dear Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait. So Mary took note of this and went about her way. The next morning, she comes back to room 1046. She arrived at about 10:30 in the morning and she came to just do some normal cleaning. This time, the hotel door was locked from the outside. And when she opened the door, she ended up just seeing Roland sitting there in the dark in a chair, just chilling alone in the dark, doing nothing once again. So Mary went in there and just cleaned like normal. And while she was cleaning, Roland ended up getting a phone call, and when he answered it, he said, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. I just had breakfast. No, I'm not hungry." So Mary left again, and she came back later that day, again around 4 p.m. to bring some fresh towels to the room. But when she brought these towels, she noticed that there were 2 men talking behind the door of room 1046. When she knocked on the door, she said she heard a voice of someone who wasn't Roland asking, "Who is it?" She said, "It's me, Mary the maid, and I'm here to bring you fresh towels." And this is when she heard a strange man's voice say, "We don't need any." So that same night, there was a taxi driver driving around doing his normal shift, and his name was Robert Lane. And he reported picking up a strange man just a few blocks away from the President Hotel. And Robert said that this guy was only wearing boxers and a t-shirt, looked like he was just in pajamas, and it was freezing outside. So he pulled over and he got in the taxi. He claims that he was pretty beaten up and that he was talking about how he was going to kill that guy tomorrow. Eventually, the man ended up getting out of the taxi, and that was the last that Robert ever saw of him. And the next day, there was a woman next door to room 1046 in room 1048. And she claimed that she was kept up all night by a female and male voice fighting with each other. However, it should be noted that there was a party over in room 1055, so it could have been sound from that, but we're not really sure. The following night, the elevator operator, Charles Blocker, said that there was a woman going to the 10th floor who he described as a commercial woman. She was kind of fancy looking, regal, and kind of out of place for this area. So she went upstairs to the 10th floor and she said she was looking for someone in room 1026, but you know, could she have been confused and been actually looking for 1046? But she said she was never able to find anyone, and eventually she left the hotel. So the next morning after this, January 4th, around 7 a.m., one of the hotel staff notices that there's a phone off the hook in Roland's room. They could tell that the phone had been off the hook for several hours, so they decided to send somebody up there. So they sent Randolph Probst, the bellboy who originally brought Roland into the hotel. And apparently when he got to the room, there was a do not disturb sign on the door, but he went ahead and tried knocking on the door a few times, but no one ended up answering. After a little while, he almost gave up, but he kept knocking, and eventually someone said, "Come in and turn the lights on." Randolph tried to open the door, but he wasn't able to get in because it was locked and no one was getting up to answer the door and let him in. Not being able to get in, but hearing that there was a voice, he claims that he basically thought that this guy was drunk, and he ended up telling him just through the door, "Yo, like, put the phone back on the hook." And then he left. About an hour and a half later, the people down at the front desk realized that the phone was still off the hook, so they sent another bellboy up there named Harold Pike. The door was locked, but he decided to go ahead and let himself in because he had a master key. And when he walked in, Harold claims that he saw Roland in his bed naked and drunk. But there was a large dark spot around his body on the bed. And this is when he saw that the phone stand in the corner of the room was actually knocked over and just laying on the floor, and that's why it was off the hook. So he, fixes that up, puts the phone back on the hook, says whatever about the naked guy laying in probably his blood on the bed, and just leaves. Not only did he leave, he didn't tell anyone about what he saw. So a few hours later, around 10:45 a.m., the phone operator noticed that the phone had been taken off the hook again. So this time they sent Randolph back up there to check on him again. And this is when he saw Roland actually with his head in his hand on all fours in really horrible condition. There was blood all around him and all over the hotel room, including the walls, the ceiling, and Roland was tied up with a telephone cord around his neck, his hands, and his feet. He also had several stab wounds to his chest. It was really bad. One of his lungs was just completely punctured. And he had all of these marks on his head, likely from being beaten, and also marks on his neck, likely from being strangled. But despite all of this happening to him, he actually was still alive. And when police arrived, he was still conscious and talking to them. They asked, what happened to you and who did this? And he said, no one did this. I fell against the bathtub. So obviously, we don't believe that for a second. There's clearly someone that was scaring him enough to not want to tell the truth about what was happening. So they ended up bringing Roland to the hospital, and when they did, they realized that the accident or whatever happened to him probably happened about 7 hours before they brought him in. So this would mean that this actually happened to him before the first time that Randolph went in there to check on him around 7 a.m. The detectives didn't find any type of weapon in the room, so they could rule out the possibility of suicide or self-injury, and they came to the conclusion that someone must have attacked him. There were 4 fingerprints found on the phone that were thought to be from a female, but we honestly don't know. There wasn't great technology for that back then. They weren't able to do any real testing on it, so they just figured it was a female by the shape of it, pretty much. And while Roland was in the hospital, he ended up falling into a coma, and he did end up passing away on January 5th, 1935. And the hospital obviously wanted to confirm his identity, see if they could contact anyone on his behalf, but they had no idea who exactly he was. He didn't have any ID on him. All they had was the name that he checked into the hotel with. And you can check into a hotel as pretty much anything. They ended up looking in all of Los Angeles because the hotel said that that's where he was from, and they were not able to find any record of a Roland T. Owen anywhere. So this is when they started to question, whether or not that was actually his name. So the word got out that he was kind of a John Doe, and people started calling and trying to see if he was their missing loved one. Some articles about this story actually say that they put his body up for display, which is something they would do back in the day, and that they had people come all over to see and, see if it was anyone that they knew and could have lost. However, they were not able to make any connection, so he remained a John Doe for a little while. So police started to look into Don and whoever he was talking to on the phone. They thought maybe Don was the guy that talked through the door to Mary when she was trying to bring them towels. But despite their efforts to figure out who Don was, they were not able to get a single lead. So Roland was going to be buried in a potter's field. No one was there to pay for anything, so they were just going to put him in the potter's field. However, the funeral home that he was being held at actually received an anonymous phone call from someone who wanted to pay for Roland's funeral completely in full. And then on March 23rd, money actually did arrive at the funeral home. And after he was buried, there were actually some flowers anonymously sent to him from the Rock Flower Company. And it was accompanied with one of those little greeting cards, and it said, "Love forever, Louise." So fast forward to about a year later, there was still no idea who Roland actually was until this woman named Ruby was reading a magazine and an article about the story. And this is when she realized that Roland was actually her son. Apparently, he left Birmingham, Alabama in 1934, and his real name was actually Artemis Ogletree. And their estimate of, 20 to 35 was way off. He was actually only 17, very young. When he left Birmingham, he had intentions of traveling all across the United States, but he somehow ended up in California. And according to his mom, when he first left, he would write her letters all the time and keep her up to date about what he was doing. But as time went on, the letters became fewer and farther between, to the point where she didn't even really, keep track of him super well, and she had no idea that anything had happened to him. Seems like a bit much, after a year, you'd think you'd be a little concerned. Now, usually Ruby received handwritten letters from Artemis, but in the spring of 1935, she actually received 3 letters that were all typed out from Artemis. And this was really strange because as far as she knew, Artemis didn't even know how to use a typewriter. Also, the letters were coming from different places around the country, such as Chicago and New York. And there was slang and language in it that she just felt like wasn't her son's. And what makes it even stranger is that she received these letters after Artemis had already passed away. So clearly someone else is writing letters pretending to be her son. So in August of 1935, Ruby ended up receiving a phone call from a long-distance phone number, and it was a man who claimed to be named Jordan. Jordan told her about how he actually had met Artemis and they became good friends up until he passed away, and that he and Artemis had been on all these adventures over the last few years and started filling her in on everything. He said that at one point Artemis got into a bar fight and lost one of his fingers, and that's why he had to start using a typewriter instead of handwriting out his letters to her. He also told her that Artemis decided to move to Cairo, Egypt, and that he married a very high-class Egyptian woman. And despite all of this strange detail that came from this phone call, nothing ever came of this call, and it was never able to be traced. And then in the early 2000s, there was a doctor named James Horner, and he was working on Artemis's case. And he ended up getting an anonymous phone call from someone claiming to know Artemis. The caller claimed that they found basically a huge box filled with articles about the case. They were being hoarded by some old man. And then the man passed away, and he thought it was a little sketch that he had this, so he reported it. But nothing ever came out of this either. So let's talk about some of the theories about what people think could have happened, because there's definitely no answer for sure. It's unsolved and no one has any idea what truly happened in room 1046. But it was later discovered that Artemis also stayed at the St. Regis Hotel in Kansas City. And apparently he stayed there with another man. And a lot of people think that this man could have been Don. And then a lot of people believe that that woman in the elevator who looked pretty fancy and was looking for someone on floor 10 was somehow involved with the murder. Charles also said that he saw this woman talking to some man on the 9th floor as well. Some people think that this could have been Don, and the two of them were plotting and working together to kill Artemis. And another hotel employee actually reported that they saw a man and woman quickly fleeing the hotel. They looked like they were in a hurry, and this is only a few hours after they had found Artemis's body. This would explain those female fingerprints in the hotel room. It would explain the voices fighting that the other woman in 1048 heard. And some people actually think that Artemis was killed for being unfaithful to his fiance. There was, a ton of articles and speculation coming out when this first happened in local papers and magazines and stuff. And people were really just speculating on what could have happened. And there was actually one article from the Kansas City Journal that reported the whole story about how he was going to be buried in a potter's field, but someone called and anonymously paid for his whole funeral. And there were other articles speculating that maybe he could have cheated and, kind of questioning his character. And there's actually this article that was published in the Newcastle Sun newspaper. And in the article, they claimed that a woman called them and told them that they had, some stories wrong, some details wrong, and that he was not like that. And when they asked her who she was, how she knew him, what's the story, she said, "Never mind, I know what I'm talking about. He got into a jam," and then hung up. And then during that same time that the funeral home got the call saying, "I'll pay for Roland's funeral," that same man continued to explain that Roland had cheated on his fiance, and that his fiance visited him in room 1046 for a little meeting, which basically means she killed him. So some people think that that is what happened. But beyond these theories, there is really no solid lead for what happened. There's definitely not one direction that people are leaning in more than the other. It's just a really creepy one. The way that he was just sitting in the dark room, clearly waiting for someone to come back. Did someone come back? It'd be great if they had cameras back then. I'd love to know what you guys think of this case, what you think could have happened. And that's it for Freak Week 2019. I hope you guys enjoyed this week. Normal content will resume on my channel pretty soon here. I'm gonna be taking a couple weeks off to work on a project for 2020. That's gonna be awesome. I'm really excited for you guys to see what I have in store. It's gonna take me a lot longer to work on, but I'm very excited for it. And I just gotta say before I go, be sure to check out my merch shop. It just launched October 31st. We have all new merch and it is very limited quantities, so if you want something, grab it now. But that is it for me today, guys. Stay spooky all year round, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.